Welcome. This is our monthly San Diego Independent Scholars Zoom lecture. And the speaker this month is Dr. Edward Louis Goldberg. The title of his talk is Presidential Health Matters. So Dr. Goldberg retired from his practice of internal medicine in January of 2000. But throughout his career in medicine, he has had a love of history, of American history. So this came together for him in his recent book called Presidential Health Matters. The book explores the medical history of the US through the lives of 46 presidents. And Dr. Goldberg brings the perspective of a practicing primary care internist to this account. And he asks how and why medical events took place as they did, from the siege of Boston in 1775 to COVID-19 in 2020. And his argument is that the history of the advance of medicine and the history of the United States were intertwined. We will hear about that, and here's Dr. Goldberg. You'll have to unmute, Dr. Goldberg.
Yes, thanks for the invitation to speak. Yes, it is true. I went to medical school at the very strong suggestion of my father, who had wanted to be a doctor himself and had to give up my career as a history teacher. But nevertheless, around 2020, I started writing a book about the health of the presidents. But COVID happened, and I began to see that there was more going on than the health of the president, and that the president would become a major player in dealing with healthcare issues that would have a critical importance for the history of the United States. And certainly we can safely say that about the COVID epidemic. And this was to be the new focus of my book. I changed the title from Parade of Presidents to Presidential Health Matters, matters as a noun and a verb. And I would write more than an anthology. And I'll discuss the book cover in a little bit. Now, science can be seen as a continuum, with each generation expanding upon the knowledge of their predecessors. And the march of science was sometimes accelerated by bursts of genius like Newton and Darwin and Einstein. And as Isaac Newton explained, if I could see further than others, it is by standing upon the shoulders of the giants that came before me. I like that analogy, looking backwards. So the theme of the book continued to evolve and began to include the historic and ongoing struggle to incorporate the precepts of modern science into dealing with healthcare issues. The recent battle of the COVID pandemic is the latest manifestation of the collision between science and politics. The prize of this battle, whose truth will prevail? So I began to construct this book along two different pathways. The first was to see this as a tapestry.
Oh, it's hopeless. I can't get anything.
Oh, so the book is similar to a tapestry, woven together from many threads as warp and weft, yes. And this concept dates back to Homer's time. The weaver uses many threads, horizontal and vertical, to create a tapestry. The horizontal threads may carry different themes. The vertical threads carry different timelines. And where they intersect, the weaver may make a knot. And at that knot may be the locus for some storytelling. And so a tapestry of multiple connections is made. And the writer has become like a weaver, bringing together and intertwining seemingly disparate threads to create a comprehensible story. And the difficult part of this writing this book becomes the ability to demonstrate the connectedness of events, both medical, historical, and political, events which seem at first glance to have nothing to do together. So let's see how that plays out. What could be the possible connection between influenza in 1918 and Adolf Hitler? Okay. So in 1919, President Wilson went to Paris to help write the Paris Peace Treaty. And in April of that year, he developed influenza. And that left him with some neurologic changes, the most profound of which was a dramatic loss of intellect. He was no longer as smart, no longer as sharp. He just wasn't the same guy. And this was the man who the world said would make the world safe for democracy. Well, that didn't happen. And he no longer had the mental capacity to take on the British and the French with their desire to create a punitive peace treaty. And only one of his 14 points, remember he had 14 points, only one of them made it into the peace treaty. That was the creation of the League of Nations. The others, such as free trade, racial equality, etc., were defeated. So the punitive peace treaty was signed, and what were the results of this? There was a food blockade that lasted after the armistice and lasted into June of 1919, after the combat was over, and 500,000 Germans died of famine. This overlapped in time with the third wave of the influenza epidemic. So this was a time of great suffering in Germany. The Saarland and the Rhineland were both occupied by French African troops. There was massive inflation. Germany lost her colonies. And of course, the war guilt clause was written into the peace treaty. The Germans naturally thought they got a raw deal, and they viewed this treaty as unfair and punitive. And that was a widespread belief. And so, like dragon's teeth planted in 1919, the clauses of this treaty sprang up to become the rise of the Nazis in 1933. Seemingly disparate events have been connected. And I've also shown how the health of one US president had a major impact upon the nation and the world. Okay. Now, my next image is a timeline that I created. And on the left-hand side, you can see the list of presidents starting from Washington and going down to Biden. The dates are written in the appropriate columns. And next to them, I wrote medical events that occurred in their time. So you can see that Joseph Lister was working with antisepsis in 1872, and that was during the time that Grant was president, and Hayes, and Garfield would come a few years later. And sometimes these timelines were in synchrony, and sometimes they weren't. And but prior to 1912, your chances of getting some benefit from going to the doctor were less than 50-50. And that was basically because the major therapy was called heroic medicine. And that involved bloodletting, use of counter irritants, and widespread use of heavy metals such as mercury and lead. Not surprisingly, not many people got better. And these horrors were inflicted upon four of our presidents: George Washington, Andrew Jackson, William Henry Harrison, and Zachary Taylor. The tipping point occurred around 1912. And what led to that? Well, the first great thing was the application of Joseph Lister's antiseptic technique. And here you can see this in action. Dr. Joseph Lister is the surgeon in the middle holding the scalpel. And we know this is modern times because the man on the left is administering ether via an ether cone. The man on the right is producing a steam of carbolic acid that's streaming over the operative site and the hands of the surgeons and their instruments that they put on there. This would kill many or most of the bacteria that were in the area. And amazingly, this little simple technique caused a dramatic decline in operative surgical infections and a marked improvement in surgical mortality. And this was about 1860s that Lister started doing this. There were also vaccines were beginning. And the first vaccine was diphtheria vaccine in 1895, which was very successful in treating and preventing diphtheria. In about 1880s, 1890s, the cities of Europe began to filter their drinking water, removing the cholera organism and ending cholera epidemics in the cities. And of course, we all know the famous stories about the control of the mosquitoes that led to the control of malaria and yellow fever. It was the rise of public health. And there was Florence Nightingale, the British nurse who changed the world. When she went to the Crimea during the Crimean War, of all things, she took over a hospital that had a 40% mortality. And within a few months after her reforms of cleaning the place up, mortality in the British hospitals dropped to 2%. Very dramatic. And let's see what happened. Hospitals became less crowded, they became clean, and they became well ventilated. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the Armory Square Army Field Hospital, Washington, D.C., 1865. You can see that all the windows are open. You can see that it's a big, spacious place. You can see that they believed in sunshine. There's a little solarium in the back. And you can see it's very clean. There's no trash on the floor. It looks very clean. And this was the model of the modern hospital for many years. And as a matter of fact, this looks exactly like the house of the Good Shepherd Hospital in Syracuse, where I interned in 1965, 100 years later. The long wards, the open windows, etc. Okay. Oh, the operative mortality at the beginning of the Civil War was incredible. No one really measured it because most people died. But because of these reforms and other things that went on, such as the creation of subspecialists, rapid evacuation of patients to the hospital, the overall hospital mortality at this hospital in 1865 was 8%. Not bad. Well, the other great thing that happened was Johns Hopkins Hospital became the model of medical educational excellence. And that's why I chose it for the cover of my book. Not that I ever got accepted into Hopkins, but I can appreciate this was a really great place. This portrait of the four doctors was painted by John Singer Sargent. They each separately went to his studio in London to have their individual portrait painted, which he assembled to make this portrait, and now hangs in the medical library at Johns Hopkins Hospital. Well, let's talk about these four doctors. And starting, these four doctors were taught by the greats of European medicine: Rudolf Virchow, Joseph Lister, Marie Curie. And they in turn taught several doctors who you may have heard of: Walter Reed, William Gorges, Simon Flexner, who first headed the Rockefeller Institute, and Harvey Cushing, the father of modern neurosurgery. So Welch is sitting to your left. He was the founding member. He brought the others to Hopkins. Osler, the man with the mustache, the middle, was the great internist of his day. He revolutionized the training of medical students and medical residents. Howard Kelly, with his hand to his face, was a pioneer radiotherapist who received his first source of radioactive material directly from Marie Curie. And William Halsted in the rear performed the first radical mastectomy in the world. He was the first one to use surgical gloves during surgery. And he was a champion of anatomical accuracy in surgery. Interesting, the gloves were first used to prevent the irritation that carbolic acid caused on the hands, and the lowered surgical mortality was incidental finding, if you would. So the effect of medical events on US political history has been profound. And since the first days of the Republic, medicine and political history have been linked. Let's go back to 1721, when there was a smallpox epidemic in Boston. And Cotton Mather learned about the smallpox inoculation from his African slave. And he asked his friend, Dr. Boylston, if he could inoculate the people of Boston with this inoculation. And Dr. Boylston did. He inoculated hundreds of people. And the people that he inoculated were significantly protected from the smallpox epidemic that was going through Boston. Saved many lives in the process. To show their gratitude, a mob of the good citizens of Boston attacked his home and threw a firebomb through his window. Well, their cultural descendants, again, have reared their ugly heads in the past few years and have attacked public health officials all across the United States, at their offices and at their homes. In 2020, Governor Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan became the target of a murder kidnapping plot because she had been and was a strong supporter of public health. In 1775, a continental-wide epidemic of smallpox began in North America that killed 130,000 people in 7 years. That's a lot when the population of the 13 colonies was only 2.5 million. And it's not surprising that smallpox played an important part of the Revolutionary War. And we'll hit on two highlights. George Washington was commander-in-chief of the army stationed at Boston during the siege of Boston in 1775. He dealt with the epidemic as no modern general has before. He instituted a comprehensive program of isolation of the city of Boston and isolation of all the sick soldiers into quarantine hospitals throughout the countryside. This was brilliantly managed. In 1777, when the army was in a relatively safe place in New Jersey, of all places, he inoculated the troops of the Continental Army, making them immune from smallpox. This gave them the ability to become healthier, but this gave them the ability to move around the countryside without fear of getting sick or making the occupants sick. And indeed, in 1781, the army was mobile enough to travel 465 miles from Newburgh, New York, to trap and encircle the British Army at Yorktown and win the war. Now let's connect the American Revolution with COVID-19. During the dark days of December 1776, an English immigrant, Thomas Paine, wrote the following: "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman." During COVID-19, the patriots, true patriots, flocked to the colors, got tested and vaccinated for COVID, taught school, drove buses, worked at the grocers, wore their facial masks, and worked in the hell of the COVID ICUs. The Sunshine Patriots could not be bothered to wear a mask in public. They would not give up their liberty to get vaccinated. Public health is a difficult concept for them. I guess my bias shows through. This opposition to public health reached an historic low with the United States Supreme Court decision, Roman Catholic Diocese of Brooklyn versus Cuomo, 2020. Epidemiological studies had shown during COVID that religious services featuring singing and chanting were sites of increased spread of COVID virus. So as a public health measure, the state of New York limited attendance at church events. The United States Supreme Court disallowed that attempt. They limited the ability of public health officials to control COVID. They seemed oblivious to the fact that 268,000 people had already died in the United States at the time of their decision. And that death toll would go on to include 1.145 million deaths by September 2003, with 103 million cases and millions of cases of long COVID. The Supreme Court did not accept the concept that the protection of the public health was a proper role of government, a concept that has long tradition in America, dating back to at least the quarantine laws of Massachusetts of 1647. And for those who want more precedent, dating back to the Old Testament, the book of Leviticus, which instructs us to isolate people with infectious sores. So does quarantine and isolation save lives? Yes, it does. And here's an example. During the 1918 worldwide epidemic of influenza, almost every nation in the world was affected, except American Samoa, which had no cases of influenza, because the entire island chain was quarantined by the US Navy. On British Samoa, only 20 miles away, 8,500 people died, 20% of the population. They did not have a quarantine. 8,500 versus 0. That's pretty good evidence. Okay. Now let's bring the US presidents into the story. And let's start with Dwight Eisenhower. In 1954, he had a heart attack, and he was treated by Paul Dudley White, who believed in the active rehabilitation of cardiac patients. Following Eisenhower's heart attack, he returned to work. He remained physically active, began a health-hearty diet, and loved to show off how much he loved to play golf. And this picture of the two of them with Arnold Palmer, of Eisenhower and Arnold Palmer, also led to a tremendous increase in middle-aged men playing golf in the United States. And I became the role model for millions of coronary patients. So previously, coronary patients were restricted to a very sedentary life. They did not work, they did not play golf, they were not sexually active. Now, Ike's army followed him onto the golf links, then went back to work and returned to the marital bed, where incidentally, it became apparent that sexual activity had no significant deleterious effects for coronary patients. So these newly active patients became strong advocates for enhanced federal aid for research, for new drugs, and new procedures. The health of one president had made a major impact and became a great benefit for the health of the nation. And as the health of the general population improved, so did the health of the presidents. And there were at least two presidents lives were saved by modern medicine. And let's start by Jack Kennedy. Jack Kennedy had adrenal insufficiency, Addison's disease. And he became desperately ill and almost died in the late 1940s. But by early 1950s, synthetic cortisol became apparent and was a lifesaver for many people, including Kennedy. 1954, he had surgery on his back, and after the surgery, he did not wake up from his anesthesia. His doctor realized that he was in adrenal crisis. They gave him large doses of intravenous steroids, and he eventually woke up and recovered. Ronald Reagan survived a dangerous gunshot wound to his chest. His survival was made possible by the modern application of the emergency care system dating back to the Battle of Gettysburg, but really modified by the experience of World War II, where medics would give American soldiers infusions of plasma right on the battlefield and get them to hospital as fast as possible, with an amazing statistic that any wounded soldier who was wounded and saw a medic or a physician had a 99 chance of survival. But amazing, huh? But okay, Reagan shot. The Secret Service knew what to do. They sped him off to George Washington Hospital Emergency Room, where he arrived 11 minutes later. As he entered the emergency room, he collapsed. He had no recordable blood pressure. The doctors moved on him very quickly, and this is what they did within the first 30 minutes. They gave him saline and blood transfusions. They put in a chest tube. They put in an endotracheal tube. They gave him oxygen. They did a CAT scan. They did peritoneal lavage. They obtained a surgical consult. They did his pre-op surgical care, and he went off to the operating room 41 minutes after he was shot. He had a benign, uneventful operative course, as witnessed by the following. Ronald and Nancy walking through the hospitals of George Washington Hospital, I think the next day after surgery. There was no need for a cover-up. That smiling face said it all. However, there's a bunch of patients. However, about 1/3 of patients, 1/3 of the prisons, time for reports. About 1/3 of all U.S. prisons were seriously ill during their presidency. And some received less than best care. Their lives could have been saved, perhaps, if they had the care that was available to everybody else at that time. So the standard of care wasn't being met. James Garfield in 1881 was shot in the back and lay on the floor of the railroad station in Washington, just outside the ladies' room. Now, I think as a primary care doctor, you would say, my God, that's a horrible thing to have my patient lying on the floor of the train station. Someone put him on a sheet, get him on a table. No, he lay there on the floor, and 15 different doctors came by and examined him. And they found his wound in his back, and they stuck their fingers into his wound to probe and see what was going on. This is probably the low point in American medical history, because these doctors gave him bacterial infection, which overwhelmed his body and caused his death after 79 days of suffering. Joseph Lister and the germ theory were disregarded, even though Lister had made a tour of the United States in 1876. In 1901, President William McKinley visited the Buffalo Exposition in Buffalo, New York, which was a marvel of modern scientific modern scientific inventions that were all about electricity. Everything was electrified. They had electric incubators. They had electric photocopying machines. They had electric ambulances. All the lights were lit up. President McKinley was shot in the abdomen. He was taken to the first aid building at about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. The only place at the Buffalo Exposition that did not have electricity. So what did they do for light? They held up pots and pans and tried to reflect the sunlight onto the operative field. They also had no retractors to open up the abdomen to make it visible to see. There were on-site ambulances that could make the run to Buffalo General in 15 minutes, but they weren't used. They waited instead for some local docs to show up after 40 minutes who tried to do surgery. And not surprising, McKinley died. 1923, President Warren Harding got sick, which sounded like a very complicated cardiac condition of both congestive heart failure and coronary disease. Now, in 1923 was 28 years after the invention of the chest X-ray and 18 years after the invention of the electrocardiogram. It was 4 or 5 years after the opening of the brand new San Francisco General Hospital. So in 1923, Harding's entourage, sailed down from Alaska to seek some definition of what was going on. They landed in the city of San Francisco. Where do you think they went? They went to a hotel and not the hospital. The hotel, which did not have either an EKG machine or a chest x-ray or oxygen or anything else for that matter. You got to say again that Harding had 5 doctors in his entourage. 5. So going to more doctors, like some of my patients, I got to go to this guy, I got to go to that guy, does not ensure good health. And Harding died under very strange circumstances. And as a result of that, there are all kinds of wonderful Harding murder mysteries that have been published in the United States. Suffice it to note that there's no accurate written account of what happened to him at any one time. And he died suddenly. The Secret Service agent who was on duty thought this was all very strange, very suspicious, and he thought that Harding was murdered. So he interviewed each doctor separately. And finally, they all agreed that he had some kind of a stroke, of which there is not any evidence in the world. But all 5 doctors wrote off on a form that the President of the United States died from a stroke. It leaves the death of President Harding still very much up in the air. Unfortunately, there is still no official mechanism today to ensure that a sitting U.S. president is receiving excellent medical care. And you can have an example of that, not so much the president, but the senators. The official physician of the U.S. Senate stated that Senator McConnell recent episodes were due to dehydration. And let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that's nonsense. They did not have anything to do with dehydration. So for President Biden, we've gotten an official statement from his White House physician. And my question always is, maybe everything he said is true, but did he say everything that he knows? So, for example, Joseph Biden has obstructive sleep apnea, but there's no mention of that in the official report. All right, to change gears a little bit. Leo Tolstoy has said that some people are in the saddle directing the flow of history, while others are swept along by history. And Thomas Jefferson and Theodore Roosevelt were clearly in control. They each had knowledge of yellow fever virus and its transmission. And Jefferson had been an eyewitness to the 1793 epidemic of yellow fever in Philadelphia. And he witnessed the absolute terror that the epidemic produced. So when the epidemic of yellow fever came to Haiti in 1803, he predicted, or he felt, that the French would feel the same way. They'd be terrified and just wanted to leave and get out of Haiti. And once they abandoned Haiti, the French would have no need for Louisiana, which had been purchased to provide food for the slaves working in the sugar fields. And so a package deal was created. New Orleans, which the United States wanted as a river port, and Louisiana which the French wanted to get rid of. The Panama Canal. The French weren't able to build the Panama Canal because of outbreaks of yellow fever again. What did they do? They left. But the United States had an ace up its sleeve, which was General William Gorges, who had just suppressed the epidemic of yellow fever in Cuba by destroying the breeding sites of the Aedes mosquitoes, which incidentally are human-made water receptacles. The mosquitoes would love to breed in an empty cup, a can, rather than in a pool outside. So the United States understood we could build the canal by eliminating the mosquitoes, eliminating yellow fever, have healthy workers, and build the canal. There are some presidents would have a positive effect. Here's my favorite. Here is the paralyzed Franklin Roosevelt swimming in the pool at Warm Springs. Somehow he felt anointed by being in these springs, but he had a mission. And the mission he created was the March of Dimes program, which was public financing for polio research. And you all know this ended in a great success, as Jonas Salk and Dr. Sabin both used March of Dimes funds to create the polio vaccine. In 1918, on the other hand, there was an influenza epidemic that killed 675,000 people in the United States. President Wilson did absolutely nothing. Even though he was an excellent public speaker, he did nothing. And so the American people were left on their own. And this was a phenomenal dereliction of duty. And I think pretty bad. Well, Donald Trump had a different approach. Prior to the COVID epidemic, he had dismantled the Pandemic Preparedness Office, which was created by George W. Bush. This was a very far-reaching and forward-looking plan that created supplies, staff, game plans, worldwide surveillance for viruses. This was no more. So when COVID struck, Trump embarked on a series of negative acts. He had the United States resign from the World Health Organization. He publicly advocated bleach as therapy for COVID. He promoted and attended large indoor rallies, which helped propagate COVID. He rarely wore a mask in public and publicly berated those who did. He turned over detailed management of COVID to the individual states that forced them to compete for scarce facilities. On the positive side, Trump did support the program to jumpstart COVID vaccine development and production. But overall, Trump's actions had a negative impact upon the health of America and the world. His leadership, or failure of leadership, led to a poor performance of the United States. According to Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, of the 210 nations in the world, the United States had the 14th highest death rate from COVID. That means that 196 nations had a lower death rate. President Trump became ill with COVID-19 and may have received non-standard care from his physician, who did not disclose the details of his illness. That supported Trump's attempts to downplay the significance of the pandemic. Okay, I want to skip ahead a little bit. In 1943, Franklin Roosevelt presented with congestive heart failure. This was missed by the White House physician, Dr. Ross McIntyre. Anna Roosevelt, Franklin's daughter, demanded a second opinion, and Howard Broun, a Navy cardiologist, appeared. He made the diagnosis of congestive heart failure and assumed primary care of Franklin Roosevelt, and essentially kept him alive for the next year and a half. But Dr. McIntyre continued to publicly state that FDR was in fine health. And he organized a nationwide cover-up, because this cover-up had multiple beneficiaries. Number one, it hid Dr. McIntyre's incompetence, his inability to make the diagnosis. It certainly improved Franklin Roosevelt's chances of getting reelected. Would the public have reelected such a sick man? The cover-up gave the Democratic Party bosses the impetus to dump Henry Wallace for the Democratic ticket and have Harry Truman take his place. This was secret. The public knew nothing about these maneuvers. The bosses felt they needed their own man in there because Franklin Roosevelt was too sick to complete his fourth term. The cover-up also protected American military intelligence and propaganda. If the Axis powers had knew about Roosevelt's illness, it would have been a tremendous victory, propaganda victory for them. So in 1945, Franklin Roosevelt and his entourage traveled 14,000 miles to and from Yalta to meet with Joseph Stalin. The last 5 hours of which were over a very rocky road in an unprotected Jeep. This is a man with heart failure. Who would have allowed this? Or could someone have said, this is bad, we're sending a sick person who's going to get sicker because of this, and he has to meet with Stalin inside the world. Let's meet somewhere else. But nobody did their duty. Nobody put the bell on the cat and said, Mr. President, you're too sick to go to Yalta. How about Dr. Broun? Oh, Dr. Broun was only a lieutenant commander in the Navy. He had no clout, and he was too low on the totem pole. Daughter Anna Roosevelt, maybe, but she didn't have much diplomatic skills or entrees, or didn't know much about the mechanisms of that. How about Dr. McIntyre? Well, clearly, as the White House physician, this is his duty and his responsibility. But he shirked his duty and responsibility and was too busy saying that FDR was okay. So the cover-up took on a life of its own. And at Yalta, the United States abandoned Poland, its fighting ally. It acquiesced to the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe, contrary to the Atlantic Charter, which both the USSR and the United States had signed. And as a result of that signing, there was not significant land combat in Europe from 1945 until the Soviets invaded Ukraine 2 years ago. want to show you a picture of FDR in his final days at the White House in March of 1945. And I want you to compare it with this picture in the late 1920s. This is a picture of a dying man. 6 weeks after returning from Yalta, Franklin Roosevelt died of a cerebral hemorrhage. And Harry Truman became president. The decision to go to Yalta was a disaster for the United States. Franklin Roosevelt died. The Soviet Union had diplomatic triumph. And Harry Truman became president, totally uninformed about war plans, diplomatic plans, knew nothing about the atomic bomb. And we have to count that his lack of preparation has to lay at the Franklin Roosevelt. I have two more things that I'll finish up. Well, John Kennedy's medical history continues to be hidden from the public. This is critical because this is a cover-up. And within that cover-up is his medical care during the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's probably true that during that time, Kennedy was taking unmonitored and unsupervised doses of amphetamines, which have a high incidence of psychosis, but have a common incidence of heightened awareness and having a tendency for people, when given options, to choose the most dangerous option. It might be appropriate for us, a destroyer commander in combat, but not for a nuclear weapon commander. But the worst presidential cover-up occurred in October 1919, when Woodrow Wilson was totally incapacitated with a stroke. Totally. He could not speak, he could not do anything. And he lay in bed for 2 months. But he did not resign. His wife and his physician covered up his disability. And when last I checked, the president's physician is not included anywhere in the Constitution. But Mrs. Wilson and Carrie Grayson both did a little bit of executive function, mainly signing some bills into law. For 17 months, 17 months, say it again, 17 months, from October 1990 to March of 1921, the United States did not have a president. They did not have one until the inauguration of Warren Harding. Well, besides being a curiosity, were there any consequences of this? Why, yes, there were. The United States Senate never passed the Treaty of Paris, a treaty that required a 2/3 vote in the Senate and required a hands-on approach by the President of the United States to implement. During the 17 months saw the rise of the Red Raids. American residents were taken from their homes and deported to the Soviet Union on flimsy charges of being traitors. These 17 months were open season on blacks, especially black soldiers in uniform who were returning home. This was the year of the Tulsa Massacre. And of course, the major result was absent the input of Wilson in the United States, the punitive policies of Britain and England led us directly to World War II, where the United States once again went into combat, losing 400,000 men and women in the process. Okay, one little last thing, and I'll stop. Is that time? Okay. The mixing of politics and presidential mental health has always been a difficult task for physicians, politicians, and historians. Several presidents have had significant mental health issues, including 3 who had major clinical depression. They were Franklin Pierce, Abraham Lincoln, and Calvin Coolidge. And of the 3, only Lincoln was a fully functional president. Just prior to his resignation in 1974, Richard Nixon was observed to be wandering through the White House, speaking to the portraits that hung on the walls. This was probably the one-time act of a man facing ruin, impeachment, and not necessarily the signs of mental illness. And I have a whole bunch more to say about something else, but I'll quit right there. That's a good stopping point. So thank you for your attention, and welcome any questions.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Goldberg. That's a wonderful, wonderful view of history. Would you like to take a break before we get into
No, we're all set. I'm okay.
Okay. So, just to remind you, if you have a question, use the raised hand option, and I will call on you, and you will have to unmute to ask the question.
Oh, sure.
Okay. And Dr. Goldberg, could you stop the sharing of your screen? So there we go. Okay. There we go.
Let's raise your hand. Here's the question.
Okay, Alvin, please. Unmute yourself.
Yeah, it was a wonderful talk, filled with
Thank you.
a lot of interesting information. It was really, I enjoyed it very much. Thank you. But it's also true that at least in a couple of those situations where the president's perhaps diminished capacity might have been a contributing factor to the particular outcome, but not necessarily the definitive one. In other words, in the case of Wilson, he might have had his full faculties and still not been able to turn away the desires of England and France. In the case of Yolter, it may be that the circumstances were such that it wouldn't have made any difference. And even if the president were in full command, he already had made the decision to concede for a variety of other political reasons. So you can't, to me, it's hard to definitively say that this was the driving issue in those outcomes.
Well, for Wilson, when he had his influenza, there are multiple people who just commented that he had lost it, that he no longer had the ability to deal with complex issues. When he got back to Washington, he took it upon himself to try and arrest automobile drivers who were speeding through the city. He called the British ambassador and threatened to cut off diplomatic relations with England because he had heard a dirty joke told in the British embassy. This does not sound like a guy who's playing with a full deck who's going to deal with the nuances of taking apart the Ottoman Empire and what to do. So, yes, how do you prove the absence of something? I don't know. I just want to say that these guys, especially Wilson, much better evidence for Wilson not being mentally capable. FDR is debatable, and Dr. Braun, who was in Yalta, said that FDR intellect was intact the whole time, but he was so weak and fatigued that he had a hard time continuing and paying attention. So I don't know, and it makes me a little leery about an 82-year-old guy going off and represent the United States around the world. I'll stop there.
Okay. Right. So I have a question about, so there's a history of using military doctors for the White House medical personnel. And I'm curious as to when that started. Does it go back all the way to George Washington, where the military doctors used? And the more modern question would be, does that affect the quality of the kind of health provider that you get?
I looked that up because I just had the same question, and it's a little murky. But by the 1920s, the tradition was that there would be an official White House physician and that he would be an officer in the U.S. Navy and would be a U.S. Navy medical officer, but not always over the years. So, for example, Eisenhower had an Army officer, but the tradition usually is a Navy officer. And the most recent ones have been Navy officers, including Dr. Ronnie Jackson. Remember Ronnie Jackson?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Ronnie Jackson, who was promoted to a 2-star admiral by Barack Obama. You have to ask yourself, what does the White House doctor have to be an admiral for? I mean, And so, yes, he becomes a big part of the military establishment. And there's always a question. Is he more military? Is he more physician? Do we want somebody like that? The fellow who was Donald Trump's physician clearly did not give a complete statement and withheld information from the public. And he was probably following some kind of command. I don't know. We're probably more likely Trump's command. But let me give you an example of the military interfering, okay? So Jack Kennedy died in Dallas, Texas, and his body was shipped to Bethesda, Maryland for an autopsy at the Naval Hospital. And the doctors, the pathologists at the Naval Hospital, noted that the morgue was filled with all kinds of Navy staff in full military uniform with all their medals and medallions. And they said there was certainly a feeling of coercion. They were instructed by the Surgeon Generals of the Navy that if they released any information to the public, they would be arrested and court-martialed. They were instructed by the Navy brass not to dissect the head any further than the bullet wound. The information, several pieces of information were not released to the general public and did not make the light of day until 1992. So I think the answer to your question is yes. The military brass, I mean, if somebody threatened to arrest me and court-martial me specifically, I'd be thinking that I'm going to do what they say. They were instructed to do the autopsy in a hurry. They were instructed to do their report in a hurry. They were allowed to burn the first copy of the autopsy by their superior officers. So not a great moment for military medicine. So there's that. As long as I'm talking about the autopsy, I want to say that the autopsy of 1963 made no mention of Kennedy's adrenal glands or that he did have adrenal insufficiency. No mention, just not mentioned. And when they were interviewed in 1992, the pathologist said, oh, yes, he did have adrenal glands. Oh, yes, they were very atrophied. Oh, yes, he did have adrenal insufficiency. So there's clearly coercion that took place in the autopsy room, and probably much of it done by the military.
Lisa, could you unmute yourself, Lisa?
So follow-up question on that. So I recently watched a documentary on the use of amphetamines during World War II for pilots and other fighters. And so I caught briefly about methamphetamine. So did Kennedy abuse methamphetamine? Could he have been a meth addict? Is that a possible or just way out there?
No. There's a lot of good evidence that he was a patient of Dr. Feelgood, Dr. Max Jacobson, who was a generous purveyor of narcotics and methamphetamines, and was witnessed and observed taking medicine out of his pocket and giving it to patients. He made over 30 visits to the White House that were recorded, visits to Kennedy's home in Hyannis and Palm Springs that were not recorded, and traveled with Kennedy to Europe twice, where he was noted to inject Kennedy in the neck with an unrecorded dose of amphetamine during his meetings with Charles de Gaulle. Now, lest you think that's impossible, Max was quite the guy. He was recorded as purchasing 700,000 needles and syringes to inject patients over a 3-year period. And when New York State found out about this, they lifted his medical license, you would think. So we don't know that he was an addict. We have no evidence that he was an addict, but he was a user. And he did not have a bona fide physician monitoring that. He did a lot of this on his own. When he felt fatigued, because because cortisol is given once a day. You can't divide it up according to how you feel during the day. It's a once a day dose, covers all events, good days, bad days, horrible days. So he would supplement his cortisol with amphetamines. He'd also supplement it with testosterone, which also has its own mental health issues, like increased amount of activity. And so that becomes a big issue. It would be nice to have a record of that. Is there a record of that in the Kennedy files? Perhaps. We don't know. I don't know what's there. But, the Kennedy family recently released 95,000 pages of notes. And as far as we know, nothing significant has been found in them. So they didn't release the core stuff that people are looking for. I'm sorry, did I interrupt anybody?
Just a follow-up question on that. Do you think it could be related to his to World War II? I documentary that said that these drugs were used to get people to get through combat, like
Yes,
flyers and whatnot.
mostly Navy people. That's the best record of that, I think. Yeah, but think of the risk. If I'm a destroyer, what's at risk? It's my life and the people in my squadron, not the world. The world's at risk if the nuclear command is on amphetamines. So it'd be nice to know.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, I don't see any other questions. So maybe I can ask you one final one.
Please.
So there's a growing, one of the things I'm concerned about is a growing skepticism about science and about medicine. And we saw that with the vaccines, this growing skepticism about how effective they are, whether they work at all, et cetera. So if you had a magic finger, how would you change that growing skepticism in the population?
Right. You asked a question that's impossible to answer. I'll give you some of the things I think could be done. It's clearly that public health is a stepchild in the American scheme of things. The sense of doing my community duty by being a volunteer fireman, by raising my neighbor's barn, by sitting on the front porch and taking part of a neighborhood watch, by getting myself vaccinated to protect my grandfather, is something that's lost in America today. And you've heard people respond to that by saying we need some kind of a national service where people can come together and understand what a community is all about, and understand that I get vaccinated not just for myself, but for my city, my nation, my school children, etc. That I think that sense is lost. Second of all, public health education is almost zero. Less than half the schools in the United States have a school nurse. And yet we have many billionaires, going around the world building this. No. And the whole idea about teaching public health, teaching young girls the biology of their bodies to prevent unwanted pregnancy, teaching so many things that could be done that aren't being done. And we can see this in the amount of attacks on public health officials, where these mobs went to their homes and knocked on the door and yelled and screamed and threw things through the window. And many of these public health officials happened to be young women at home with their children. But just something horrible. Something horrible has happened. I'm not sure what the answer is. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what the answer is. I think that you can't graduate from school unless you know a little bit about public health and how your body works. I mean, that's really important. I haven't given you a satisfactory answer. There is no satisfactory answer. Oh, but in every state and every city, the public health budget's been dramatically decreased. And you can clearly plot the rise of sexually transmitted disease in a city with a decrease in the hiring of the public health officials to go out and trace venereal disease. So if you fire these people, the rates go up, and they go up a lot. And it's no surprise. You got me on my high horse here. It's no surprise to me that what goes along with this is a decline of longevity in the United States that preceded COVID. It's US longevity is decreasing. And we should be very worried about that. We're several years behind Canada, many years behind Japan, and we are decreasing. So public health is very important. It's been abandoned. I don't see anybody, any politician saying, we've got to get some more public health going. We need some more public health nurses.
Okay, well, wonderful. Well, thank you, Dr. Goldberg. This is fascinating talk.
Thank you very much. And anybody who wants to know more can read my book, Presidential Health Matters. Appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Okay, take care.